Hi everyone, it's John. Back another week, another book review. Glad to bring one to you. This week's is going to be pretty short and sweet. I don't have too much to say about it, so it's not going to be one of those lengthy, fully fleshed out reviews. But I did want to drop a word about it just in case anyone out there had a similar interest. This book is by a historian whose name you may have heard of if you're interested in sort of academic history. His name is Eric, that's what the E stands for. I'm not so sure about the J, but it's Eric Hobsbawm. And this book is Nations and Nationalism Since 1780, Program, Myth, and Reality. And basically what it is, it's a book about nationalism, the emergence of the idea, how it came about, how it's progressed, and nationalism up through, as I'll say in the review, up through around the time of the First World War. The question of what makes a nation is one that seems like it might have really definite answers until you actually try to scratch beyond the superficial, at which point you'll find out that it's actually a much more difficult question than you might have thought when you first asked it. Does it have anything to do, for example, with how we psychologically identify with our neighbors or communities? Does it have to do with having a common language or culture or an ethnic identity or background? Or is it really more of a collective myth told by and to us as human beings because we derive fundamental meaning and value from such stories? Our nations, to borrow the considered language of Benedict Anderson, writing on precisely the same subject, nothing more than, quote-unquote, imagined communities. Overall, this whole imagined communities tack is really where Eric Hobsbawm goes in answering these kinds of questions in Nations and Nationalism. Hobsbawm's book is an expansion of 6 lectures that he gave at Queen's University in Belfast in the mid-1980s, 1985 specifically. The Weil lectures, they were called. And he actually said that the entire location of the lectures in Belfast is what prompted the topic. Of course, there being a lot of nationalism there, and needing of feeling of separation and breaking off and being your own sort of independent entity. Of course, these lectures were a little bit expanded upon and filled out more than you might see in a usual academic lecture so that they could be presented in the form of a book. With the exception of the last chapter, his discussion covers the concepts of the nation as novelty, so basically the beginning of the ideas of nationalism, which he places, by the way, around the time of the French Revolution, and to a lesser extent around the time of the English Revolution, a century and a half before, to the apogee, what he calls the apogee of nationalism, which he dates to right after the end of World War I. For those interested in the topic of nationalism, outside of the European long century, the long century, for those of you unfamiliar with the term, just basically is the 18th century plus roughly 20 years of, let's say 15 years of the end of the 18th and 15 years of the beginning of the 20th. So it's usually seen as the century, the long century, from the French Revolution to the beginning of World War I. Usually referred to that way because when you use those two end dates as bookends, you are actually able to to talk about much more historically interesting things. If you say you're just going to talk about the 19th century, well, then you obviously can't talk about the French Revolution, and you really can't say too much about World War I, both of which are historically important. So historians have come up with this term called the long century, in which you can have this idea in which you can meaningfully talk about both historical occurrences. So here's sort of the downside. This book is well referenced in the topic of nationalism and nationalism studies, and it's very widely read and recommended in the area of that particular part of political science or sociology. But while Hobsbawm is probably one of the best 20th century historians, just the erudition is vast and sort of boundless, and there's a lot that leaves that is desired when it comes to his actual writing style. It's very wooden and not very engaging, even in a short book. I mean, this is 150 pages or so. And this is coming from someone who, I mean, look at my look at my YouTube history. I don't read popular fiction a lot. I read popular books, but I read a lot of sort of heavy history and philosophy, books about ideas, and with more academic content, and this still was a little rough to make it through. Despite some of the reviews in academic journals that actually called the book easy and fun to read, and one even mentioned that it was for a popular audience, which I thought was really hilarious. I have to disagree on both counts. The ideas are presented, but they're often qualified and limited, and which is a good, thorough way of doing things. But for a popular audience, at least, they want statements that they can sort of squarely take away from a book and apply to their lives. Not nationalism was like this, except for this way and this year, but here's one exception, and that tends to not be what a popular audience wants, even though I didn't think this was going to be for a popular audience when I picked it up in the first place. So the ideas are a little bit, like I said, qualified, limited, circumscribed, and sometimes that tends to obscure the conversation more than it tends to elucidate it. I've always been interested in nationalism, ever having since read Anderson's Imagined Communities, which I mentioned above. And Hobsbawm's book was one of the titles that kept appearing in the books that I would read around Imagined Communities. So it sort of touched off an interest. I read several books, and many of those books mentioned this. But there have to be better books out there than this, and I have read several of them. I've reviewed a couple several years ago that are still on my channel, but I can't help that there are just much more useful, important, and more importantly, well-written books out there that offer a more comprehensive and integrated sort of framework, which this is completely lacking in which to discuss the past, present, and future of nationalism and some of its more interesting peripheral topics. So, unfortunately, a book you find everywhere within a relatively small field, but one I didn't get a lot of insight from, unfortunately, and one that was really quite a slog to read. Sorry to say it, but Nations and Nationalism Since 1780. Program, Myth, and Reality by Eric Hobsbawm. I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.